from my end. There you go. Hello, everyone joining us on Facebook. Really, really nice to have you here. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Rachel. I'm the Research Communications Manager at Blood Cancer UK, and I am joined with an absolutely incredible group of panelists this evening, and I will let them introduce themselves. Maggie, do you want to start?
Yeah, sure. Hello, I'm Dr. Maggie Wearmouth. I'm here because I'm a JCVI member. I'm actually a retired paediatric consultant. I'm a bioethicist. I'm currently a part-time GP, and when I've got the energy, I vaccinate.
Women of many talents. I think you'll find we've got many women of many talents on the call this evening. Emma, over to you next.
Yeah, hi. My name's Professor Emma Morris, and I'm a consultant haematologist, and I work at UCLH, the Royal Free, and the Royal Free, and I clinically am interested in bone marrow transplantation and gene therapy and cell therapy. But I've been leading a Blood Cancer UK funded research project looking at responses to COVID-19 vaccines in patients with B-cell malignancies and other forms of lymphoma.
Thank you, Emma. And Emma is also leading a study called COVACH. It is COVACH,
yeah,
isn't it,
yeah.
Emma? Which is one of our vaccine studies, which is really great, and she can talk a little bit more about that. And then Alison, over to you.
Good evening, everybody. I'm Alison, and I'm an infectious diseases specialist, and I work at North Manchester General Hospital Infectious Diseases Unit. I spend a lot of my time in clinical research, and since the beginning of the pandemic, I've been involved in multiple studies evaluating new COVID therapies in hospitalised patients, but also I've been involved in the COVID vaccine trials and also the monoclonal antibody studies. And I was a principal investigator for both Provent and Storm Chaser monoclonal antibody prevention studies, which hopefully I'll get a chance to talk to you about a bit later.
Thank you, Alison. And we also do have Claire Amaladoss joining us, who's the Deputy Director for Vaccine Deployment Strategy at NHS England. But unfortunately, just as she joined, there was a fire alarm in her building, so she has now been chucked out into the streets of London. But she's promised us that she'll join as soon as she can get back into the building. So Claire, we hope you're not too cold. Take your time. We look forward to seeing you. Just before I begin, if you see me looking to my left a little bit, that's just because I'm looking at the comments in the chat. Actually, it might be the right for you, sorry. But please pop your questions, any questions you have for our panelists in the comment section on Facebook, because I am monitoring that and I will pose your questions to our lovely panel. But I do have a couple of questions that have come through already that I will start with. And Maggie, if it's okay, I think I will start with you. So at the moment, we're at a stage where people are starting to get their third primary vaccine doses. So if you could just give us a little bit of background of the science behind why people are having a third dose and not a booster, and who is eligible for a third dose.
Right, yes, thank you. This is for immunosuppressed patients. There are about 500,000 of them, we reckon, in UK. And we know from the basic science that if you don't have functioning T cells and B cells, either because of disease or because of treatment for disease, you're not going to respond well to any vaccine at all. So we know that some people, even if they have 2 vaccines in the correct way, they are not going to respond, and they may well not be covered in the same way, the level of immunity. So clearly, once the vaccine program started, we needed to monitor the response or not within the population of these people to decide what, if anything, could be done to help them to try and keep this very vulnerable group of people, many of whom who had had a miserable time self-isolating throughout the beginning of the pandemic. We wanted, as a panel, to know as much information as we could to be specific as how we could take easy and easy steps to add to the protection of a highly vulnerable group of people. We were helped very much in this by the government and charity sponsored Octave study. I can't remember what it's called, but T is definitely T cell and VE is vaccine efficacy. And this gave us some very important and useful information that was collated and presented to us in the middle of August. So this was done at warp speed in order to look and so that we could get a gradation of the severity of the groups who needed to be protected. So these, the groups that were looked at were everything from stable HIV to people with kidney and liver problems, to kidney transplants, to people with blood cancer. And they were put into a gradient really of moderate, severe and less severe groups of the ones that we felt were going to be best protected and best needing extra vaccination. And in the most severe group, we had people on biological medications that particularly affected their B cells, most forms of hematological malignancy and stem cell transplants, untreated HIV, and some of the agammaglobulinemias where people are born without the ability to actually make B cells and therefore antibodies. So we took the group that were most severe, and in a general statement, which we released at the end of June this year, we announced that there would be a generalized booster campaign coming in September. And because of the Octave study giving us that information in August, we were able to be much more specific in our directions. So by the 1st of September, we were able to specify the groups that we said needed a third primary dose. So we differentiated between the ordinary booster, where people have had 2 vaccines successfully and are now waning over time. We wanted a third dose to give those vulnerable group an extra chance, as well as being eligible for a booster later on. And that's what we're working on. We know that it's taken a little bit more time than we would like, and we're doing everything that we can to help and work with those issues. But they are very specific groups, and we have very specific information to go with that. But it is not something where people can just turn up at a vaccine clinic and ask for it. It has to be specified by the clinician, either a GP or a hospital specialist, to say that that person definitely meets the criteria, and to define the terms and the time at which it is best for that person to be given it. As we know that in cycles of chemotherapy, for example, there may be a good and a bad time for that person to be given it. So it's a very bespoke, tailored program for highly vulnerable people. And that, I think, is one of the problems, is it's taking a little longer than we would like to get out.
Absolutely. Thank you, Maggie, for that really detailed answer. And hopefully Claire will be able to join us a little bit later to explain a little bit more about that and about kind of why there's been a delay. Emma, you've got your hand raised. Please jump in.
Yeah, I was just going to reiterate, I think, I'm sure we'll talk about this in more detail later, but Maggie was very clear about the fact that just receiving the letter saying you're eligible for a third dose doesn't automatically allow you to walk into a vaccination centre to get it. And that has caused quite a lot of confusion and anxiety for you as patients. And we apologise for that, I guess, on behalf of all the doctors looking after you. But it's to do with the fact that legally doctors need to prescribe medicines that you receive, and there needs to be a mechanism where we can do that safely. And as Maggie said, that we can be clear that you're getting this third dose at the time that is most effective for you, and that you're most likely to benefit from it, and it won't interfere with other treatments that you're receiving. So I think there has been a bit of confusion about that, and most hematologists and clinicians who are looking after very vulnerable people are now in the process of making sure that patients have the documentation, and that can also be done through GPs, but it has been a complicating factor, I think.
Absolutely. It's been incredibly complicated, and it's been an incredibly difficult time for so many of our community, and continues to be, because I know there are many people out there who still haven't had their third dose, where the booster program seems to be going swimmingly. But what I will say is we are working on it, we are advocating, we are speaking to the right people, and doors will be opened very soon, we hope. And as I say, when Claire joins us, she'll be able to explain some more. There's a comment on Facebook from Joe Nibs. If the first 2 vaccines didn't work, I assume as determined by an antibody test, why should I have the third? And Emma, I'm going to come to you for that. Oh, and we've just been joined by Claire, I can see, which is great. But Emma, over to you on why I should have my third dose if vaccines 1 and 2 haven't worked.
That's a great question, and there will be some patients in whom, because they may still be on ongoing current therapies, that the third dose may still only make a very small difference to your antibody response. But what we have seen from most of the data that's been published so far, that we do see an incremental improvement in the response to the vaccine with additional doses. So for patients who either failed to make a response to the first vaccination dose or made a very low level response, and I'm talking about the number of antibodies that they make, then after the second dose, that can increase quite significantly, and it can increase to a level whereby it confers protection against infection. And we have also seen that we're getting some data now on patients who received a third dose, but it's very preliminary because obviously we've only just started delivering it. But again, that can improve the response. And then for other patients, there may have been, when they received their first 1 or 2 doses, they were very soon after they'd completed chemotherapy or rituximab treatment, or they'd had a bone marrow transplant, for example. And I'm assuming most of you listening to this are patients with blood cancers, so those are broadly the sorts of treatments that you will have received. And we know it's very clear that as time passes from you finishing your treatment, your chemotherapy, or your treatment that's really been affecting your immune system, as time passes, your ability to respond to the vaccine improves. So in fact, there's evidence that incremental improvement with number of doses happens, and there's also clear evidence that the longer you are from receiving or finishing your treatment, the more likely you'll respond to the vaccine. So I think definitely it's worth getting the third dose. It won't do you any harm, and it is likely to offer you some benefit and some protection from the virus. But as before, we can't say for individual patients, particularly how much that benefit will be. I think that's fair.
Yeah, absolutely. Please get your vaccine doses when you're offered them and when you're invited. It's really important. And what I also want to highlight is if you've had an antibody test and it's come back saying you've got no antibodies, that doesn't mean you have no protection from COVID. We're starting to see some evidence now of people who have had no antibodies at all, have caught COVID and have recovered, haven't even required hospitalization. And we don't know why that is. We assume it's because of T cells and other things acting in the immune system fighting the virus. But no antibodies means you need to be cautious, but it does not mean you have no protection. So even if you don't think you've responded to vaccine doses 1 or 2 because of a negative antibody test, you still might have done, and the third and the fourth vaccines will be really important. Claire, welcome back. I hope you've warmed up after being chucked out your building. I have introduced you, but would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Of course, I'm very sorry to have such a disrupted start with the fire alarm and everything else. My name's Claire, and I'm the Deputy Director of Strategy in the COVID Vaccine Deployment Programme at NHS England. I'm really glad to be here and join in the discussion.
Thank you, Claire. And I'm going to come to you now, just in case you get another fire alarm while we have you. So this is a pre-submitted question, and someone has said the rollout of the third vaccine dose has been quite problematic. Like many, when I eventually managed to get the vaccine, there was no way in the system to record it as a third vaccine, so it was recorded as a booster. When is this error going to be rectified?
So the good news is that that error has already been rectified. And so I suppose, first of all, I want to reassure you that we do have a mechanism in place now, well, where when a individual has a booster vaccine and it's recorded as such at the site, that is then cross-referenced with our data sets on your health conditions and on the individuals who we think are eligible for this third primary dose. And when those are referenced and there's a match, the record is changed to be a third primary dose. So that is happening all of the time at the moment. And what that means is that if we are in a situation in the next few months where you are, it's recommended that you have another dose of vaccination or you have a booster dose, that we have the processes in place to know that you have had a third primary dose, and to make sure that you're invited back for any subsequent vaccinations. So I hope I can reassure people that that recording is going on and is live, even though actually when the jabbing happens, you're right, the clinician in the moment will record it as a booster, but yeah, there is a technical solution to that is ongoing.
Thanks, Claire. And kind of just to say for everyone listening, Blood Cancer UK and Claire's team, we're working really closely to try and feed back problems that people are having and to rectify things. So keep telling us, we'll pass them on, and Claire and her team are being great and are really trying to help fix all of this. Claire, while we're on this topic, we've kind of talked a little bit about the difficulties of people accessing third doses and how it's really difficult for lots of our community, and there are lots of people still who can't access their third doses. So we've got Adele who's watching, who said, my GP said the vaccine was nothing to do with them and said to ring 119. 119 just said it was the booster and I was wrong. Do you have any advice for these people who are still really struggling to get their third dose?
Yeah. So first of all, I think I'd like to acknowledge that is not acceptable and is not the experience that we want anyone to have. And we're really concerned to hear about these instances of people being passed from pillar to post, and to have these quite troubling exchanges with their surgery and other teams. So I want to reiterate that we are doing all we can through our communication channels to emphasize the responsibility of GPs and of your consultant teams in identifying and either referring you for vaccination or arranging that themselves. And so we're aware that comms needs to be targeted, and it needs to go to receptionists as much as it does to doctors. And this is now being amplified through all of our channels and through NHS senior leaders. So I hope that will start to improve. One of the other things that we know is in train, and that we've, as you said, Rachel, have been in conversation with Blood Cancer UK and other charities about, is how we can explore a method where you would be able to self-declare and to present at a vaccination site. And there are various things that we need to work through to make that safe, but I suppose I just want to state how hard we are working to make that happen, and how aware we are of the issues that people are experiencing. For those of you who have got a letter from your GP or from your consultant team, you are now able to use that to access vaccination by walking into a vaccination centre or a community pharmacy. And I know, unfortunately, that isn't the case for many of you, and that you are struggling to make that contact with your GP or with your consultant, and we're absolutely trying to find another solution for those of you experiencing those difficulties. But if you have got one of those letters that is from your GP or is from your consultant and says, yes, my patient is due a third primary dose, please do use those and take those to our walk-in sites. And the list of vaccination centres and community pharmacy sites is available online. And we will be updating the NHS website. I know that that's another place where people understandably will want to go for information, and also just to support you in those conversations with your GP. So that will be up and live within the next 24 hours, and we'll have some of that signposting information on where you can go if you do have a letter.
Claire, for that really, really detailed answer. I'm sure lots of people will appreciate that. And, you know, as I say, NHS England really are working hard on this. We know they are. We're in regular contact with them. It's not ideal that this has happened, but, you know, we are working through it. And as Blood Cancer UK as well, we are trying to get the message out to as many clinical teams, treating teams, haematologists as possible, so they know that they need to refer you to get the vaccine as soon as possible. Yeah, thank you, Claire. Alison, I'm going to come to you next. Alison is our expert on alternative methods of protection. Don't look like that. You are an expert to COVID. So Alison, can you explain a little bit more about what is currently available to prevent COVID, and what we might see in the future as ways to prevent COVID that isn't vaccination?
Yes, well, unfortunately, at the moment, there is nothing currently licensed, even under emergency measures to prevent COVID other than vaccination, and obviously all the the measures that we're doing in the public, social distancing, etc. But on the horizon, I think that that there's definitely light at the end of the tunnel here. So I think when we talk about monoclonal antibodies, they can be used in different scenarios. So first of all, they can be used purely as protection, similar to a vaccine. Then we can use them as post-exposure prophylaxis. So if you are exposed to somebody who's got COVID, but you haven't developed the symptoms yet, being given them to prevent that. And then finally, they can be used actually to treat people who have COVID. Now, currently, the only monoclonals in the United Kingdom that are actually authorized are for treatment. So people who go into admitted to hospital with the severest kind of COVID, at the moment, you would have your antibody levels checked if you were above 50 or above, or if you were aged 12 to 49 but had a condition, such as a blood cancer, which would render you immunocompromised. So there's a whole host of definitions on what constitutes immunocompromised, and I won't go into that. So you'd have your antibodies checked, and then if you didn't have any antibodies, then you would be able to get a combination called Ronapreve. Now this is the Roche combination of monoclonal antibodies. I have to use my crib sheet because the names are so difficult to remember. So this is casirivimab and imdevimab. So that's what you're given, and that's the treatment. And the reason that we're using these antibodies in hospital is that the information, that the data that came from the recovery trial showed that they reduced 28-day mortality, these antibodies, from 30% to 24% if they were given to people who didn't have their own antibodies, to start off with. So that's quite clear cut to be given to individuals admitted to hospital who haven't mounted an antibody response of their own. Now, elsewhere, I believe in the States, Ronapreve is being used for post-exposure prophylaxis or for prevention, but that's not the case yet in the UK. If we look at long-term protection, so a vaccine hopefully will give you antibodies that will last for at least 6 months. You couldn't use Ronapreve for that because they won't last for 6 months. So you'd have to give them repeatedly. Yeah, so that's a bit of a problem with that formulation. But again, there are other formulations of monoclonal antibodies in clinical studies, and the one that I was involved with was the PROVENT study, and that was looking at antibodies that had been engineered to last longer. So that part of the study is to really see how long they do last at a level that gives you protection, but certainly 6 months or more. And it's AstraZeneca who have produced these monoclonal antibodies are hoping that they could last for up to 9 months or even longer, but certainly more than 6 months. So the PROVENT study has not finished, but there has been some interim data put into the public domain in August, which I'll talk about now. But just to set the scene, it's a study where more than 5,000 people were recruited globally. And unlike some of the vaccine studies, well, most of the vaccine studies where you were excluded from taking part if you had anything wrong with your immune system or you were likely not to have a good response to a vaccine, Provence sort of accepted all comers. And so 75% of people in Provence were classified as individuals that had conditions that would make them less likely to respond to a vaccine. So when they looked at the interim data, so basically you took the participants, you gave them a intramuscular injection, so not intravenous, it's an intramuscular injection of these antibodies, and then you follow them up to see how many people develop COVID, and it was compared with placebo. So when they looked at the data after about 5 months of follow-up, and the study is ongoing, then they found that the patients who'd received the monoclonal antibodies had a 73% reduction in acquiring COVID, symptomatic COVID. So that's probably on a par with, you know, some of the vaccines. So I think that's really, you know, very, very encouraging. Now, you might ask, well, you know, when are we going to be able to see these in clinical practice? Well, there's been a data lock on the study, and AstraZeneca have submitted the data to the FDA in the United States and the equivalent, the MHRA in Europe. As we speak, they've submitted it, so we really just got to wait and see what comes of that. But other, you know, other things that could be tried, which again, the studies looking at this are using antivirals as post-exposure prophylaxis. So somebody who's been exposed within a certain number of days could take a COVID antiviral, but that's still way in research. We're not anywhere near that for clinical practice.
Thank you, Alison. Really interesting. And what I will do as well is reassure people that we are very much aware how important these preventative treatments are for people with blood cancer, and we haven't forgotten about them. So again, we're doing a lot of work to try and work out where we are and what needs to be done to potentially allow people to access them as preventatives. Maggie, I'm going to come to you next. We've had a question from Dawn on Facebook, who has said, will household members that live with someone immune compromised be receiving a booster?
A booster. I can't remember, to be honest. I think we've got them included in that, but I would have to check. I'm sorry, that it would be in the list of those who are eligible. I think they probably are, but I'd have to check. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Claire, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so my understanding would be that those individuals were added to what we called cohort 6, which was people who are under 64 but might be at risk for other reasons or present risk, yes, to the individuals that they live with. So yes, they are eligible for a booster when they hit that 6-month point from their second dose.
That makes sense. Thank you for clarifying that. Claire, I'm actually going to stay with you because just for everyone at home, I just want to point out that Claire is NHS England, but we have had questions about the devolved nations, Claire, and whether your comments also apply to Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Now, you might not be able to comment on that, so no worries if you can't. But if you do have any information on that, that would be really great.
So in short, I suppose no, I can't speak for the other nations, but I do speak to them regularly, and had a conversation with colleagues on this exact point and how we can make sure that we are working together and that the approach is broadly consistent across all 4 nations. So I know that you will be being contacted in slightly different ways depending where you live, and I'm afraid I don't know the detail of each of those, but across the board in all 4 nations, I know that invites are going out, and the comms is largely through your specialists.
That's great. Thank you, Claire.
If I could just come in on that as well, is that we have a significant number of observers and advisors at all our JCVI meetings, which are 1 or 2 a week at the moment. And we have a lot of input from the devolved nations. So we're all sharing the same pot of knowledge and experience. And although the methods of service delivery may be different, the actual advice and the experience of that are being shared incredibly well and regularly, so that if people find something that works, other nations are learning from it, and we are really trying very hard to use absolutely everything we've got in the most efficient way.
Thank you both. That's really helpful. Now we're getting a couple of comments from people on our Facebook Live about how can I get an antibody test, which is a bit of a difficult one to answer. Emma, do you want to come from it from kind of a consultant perspective, and then I can talk about maybe some of the studies which allow people access to antibody tests?
Yeah. So if I'm really honest, I think it's very variable, access to antibody tests. So some hospitals and some big haematology centres are offering, or as part of their clinical care of patients, are testing antibody levels against the spike protein. So that tests your response to the vaccine rather than testing to see whether you've had exposure to the virus through infection. And that, generally speaking, we use a different antibody test to that, which tests antibodies against a protein called N, or the nuclear capsid. Other hospitals and centres don't routinely offer that because they feel that outside of the context of a clinical research trial, it is really hard to interpret the data at a single time point for an individual patient. So I'm aware of the fact that some patients are being tested and others aren't, and that's quite frustrating. The best way to get an antibody test is to be part of a clinical trial that is trying to understand what that levels of antibodies mean and how they relate to the degree of protection against infection. And there are a number of trials open across the country, and many of them are now funded by Blood Cancer UK, which has done a fantastic job in raising money and supporting a large number of clinical trials. And the results of those are coming out and they're being published quite frequently. So there's a lot of new data emerging. And so for those of you that can't get access to an antibody test, I know it's easy for me to say this, but I wouldn't worry too much, because us as doctors, we are learning from selected groups of patients who basically represent you. So groups of patients with CLL, or groups of patients with MDS, or groups of patients with myeloma, and we're able to know what's happening to their, broadly speaking, for those patients, what their response to the vaccines are, and that's guiding our recommendations on how you should be treated. I think most patients, if they're admitted to hospital or they become unwell, they will get an antibody test on admission. Do you think, Alison, as a clinician, that's a reasonably accurate response?
No, I agree totally. In my own hospital, I'm aware that some of the haematology patients have been having their antibodies checked, but I think we just don't know enough now, as you said, about the level of antibodies that we're aiming for. You know, it's difficult, and I agree with you. It's better to wait for the results of the clinical trials that are ongoing to inform us. And yes, so if somebody's admitted with COVID, then if they are in a group considered to be immunosuppressed, whatever the age, that they will get an antibody test, you know, to see what their response has been. And if they have no antibodies, then yes, they will be eligible for this additional therapy, as I was talking about, the Ronapreve. Anybody 50 and over is going to get the antibody test anyway, but if you're below that age, it's to do with whether you're immunocompromised or not. So yeah, I agree totally.
Thank you. And I will just reiterate what we said a bit earlier, that antibodies aren't everything. Antibodies are incredible, but there are a whole host of cells in your immune system that are involved in fighting coronavirus. And if you're negative, something else might kick in and do the job of fighting the virus. But I also want to do a shout out for 2 studies that I know are recruiting at the moment. First one is called Virus Watch, and that study is open to anyone in England or Wales. With blood cancer or without blood cancer, so you can get your friends and family involved as well. And they are basically looking at antibody levels and what this means, and who is likely to have protection and who is not. If you Google Virus Watch, you should be able to find it. I will message my colleague in a minute who is looking after the comments, who might be able to put a link in the chat for you. So that's England and Wales. And then for people in England, if you've been diagnosed with cancer in the last year, or if you're on active cancer treatment, you can sign up for something called the National Cancer Coronavirus Antibody Survey. Sorry, that's a long title. And that is actually being run out of NHS Track and Trace, and that is recruiting 10,000 people just with cancer to look at antibody levels in the cancer population and to work out who is more or less at risk. So those are 2 studies that you can go away and sign up for right now, but don't do it right now because we're going to answer a lot more interesting questions in the next 25 minutes. But at the end of the sessions, you can go away and sign up for them. And yeah, we want as many people with blood cancer to take part in these studies. So please do that. Maggie, back to you. Paula on Facebook has said, what time should you leave between your 3rd dose of the coronavirus jab and your flu jab?
You can have them together, no problem at all. They're very well tolerated. You might have a sore arm both sides, but at least you get it over with. The COV boost studies, the COV flu boost studies have really given us the green light to be able to give these efficiently and quickly. So if you have the choice and have the ability to have both of them, I would just get on with it and just make sure you're not doing anything too important the following day.
Absolutely, just in case you need to keep your arms by your sides instead of doing anything. Sorry, I'm just scrolling through the comments to have a look at them. On Ronapreve, there's a question on Facebook, Alison, which is a bit of a complicated one, but you might be able to answer it, because as we spoke about, Ronapreve is just for people who have no antibodies. So you're in hospital, you have an antibody test and you've got no antibodies. Can you explain why this is, and kind of explain why someone wouldn't get Ronapreve if they did have antibodies?
So the data that supports this, again, it's come from the recovery study. And just for those of you who are not aware of the recovery study, it's been ongoing since March of last year. It's a fantastic study. It's recruited more than 40,000 hospitalized patients across the country with COVID. And the data showed very clearly that if you already had made antibodies and you were given the monoclonal antibodies, the Ronapreve, it actually had made no difference to your outcome. So that's why they've written the guidelines to say only give it to people who had no antibodies. So the data is from the recovery study. Does that answer the question?
Definitely does. Thank you. Kath says, when I tried to sign up for the national study, it wouldn't let me, as it said I wasn't eligible. Kath, when the study first launched, there were a number of problems with the Track and Trace website. They have now all been rectified, so please try again, and there should be some advice on the website as well. Sharon says, I missed the start of the recording. The session, will there be a recording afterwards? Yes, absolutely. Still, sorry, I'm just scrolling through, and then we've got another question about the national survey, but yeah, please do try again on the national survey if you haven't been successful, because there were a number of problems, but they have been rectified. We have a question: is there any hope of finding out how much immunity I might have from 2 doses of AZ and 1 of Pfizer? Emma, I'm going to come back to you for that.
Oh, that's tough. So I think there are a number of studies that are looking at various different combinations of vaccination, first, second dose, third dose and booster, and some of them have cohorts, so a group of patients with hematological malignancies, so with blood cancers in them. So and comparing responses to different vaccinations. And I think Octave Duo has got a part of Octave Duo, which is a big national study open in a number of large blood cancer treating centres, is testing some of those different combinations. So that's work in progress, basically. And again, with the caveats we said before about, you know, interpreting individual data is quite difficult.
Yeah, that makes sense. And again, if you are able to sign up for one of the studies that I mentioned, definitely please do. Maggie, there was an interesting question I saw that said for the third dose or the booster, it's recommended that someone has an mRNA vaccine. So for the people at home, that is either the Pfizer or the Moderna vaccine. And they were asking, is there evidence of what vaccine should be given then for the first or second one? So for example, if someone's come out of a bone marrow transplant and needs to be revaccinated, is there a particular vaccine they should be having for number 1 or number 2, seeing as there's a recommendation for 3 or 4?
I think we will go with probably the mRNA vaccines now. We know that the AstraZeneca is very good for T-cell immunity. It's less good for the measured B-cell or antibody immunity. But I think we are now looking at mainly concentrating on the mRNA vaccines, and most of the research is with them. We certainly know that sadly, AstraZeneca is not licensed by the mRNA as being a booster, because sadly a third dose of AstraZeneca was much lower in terms of antibody response than others. So that did not receive regulation approval for being a booster. So I think we're likely to be going with mostly the mRNAs, either Pfizer or Moderna. They're all very, very good vaccines.
And it's likely now that if you turn up to a vaccination centre, they'll probably only have mRNA vaccines because they're the ones most in circulation. Claire's giving me the thumbs up. Thanks, Claire. So yeah, if you're post bone marrow transplant and you're being revaccinated, you're likely to get an mRNA. Claire, I know we touched on this earlier, but I'm just going to come back to a question that I had for you to answer just to make it really, really clear. Someone has said, if I've had a booster Pfizer jab, is that the full dose? Does it count as a third jab? I know the government's recording site for the jabs cannot yet record the third jab as the third jab.
So yes, absolutely it does. And yes, it will have been a full dose of Pfizer. And for many of you, if the invitation that you get first is for your booster, you should absolutely attend that appointment. The system for making sure that it's ultimately recorded as a third primary dose is as described earlier. So yes, that data matching will happen, and your full Pfizer dose that you received nominally in a clinic as a booster will be recorded as a Pfizer third primary dose.
Great, thank you. That's really helpful.
Claire, can I ask? This is a bit cheeky, me asking you a question, but I had a booster vaccine at the beginning of October as I'm working with immunodeficient patients and I'm a healthcare worker, but it's still not recorded on my NHS app. It just has my first 2 doses. Is that something that will change, or I just wondered whether that would be added into the system, or where I can't find an electronic record of it. I just have my little card, and I wondered whether that was something other people were experiencing.
Yeah, I can come in quickly on that, and I suppose not to defer or throw it over the fence, but I suppose it is more of it would be more of a policy question for the Department of Health and Social Care, but at the moment, because what is needed for certification purposes in this country is the first and second, that is what's recorded on your COVID pass. But yeah, of course, it's on your medical record, so I absolutely can envisage a time when that will be something that's accessible on the app.
Okay,
yeah.
perfect. I just thought if I was thinking about that, maybe other people would be too. And
Yeah, no, it's a good question.
whether there was a
definitely.
record. Yeah, fine.
Thank you, Emma. Jumped in over the chair. I'm really joking. There's a question from Leslie on Facebook. Is there a correlation between the intensity of side effects after a vaccine and its efficacy, which I think is a really interesting one. I think a couple of us might want to say a couple of things on this. Who would like to start?
I'm happy to.
Go on, Maggie.
There is absolutely no correlation between your individual, if you like, idiosyncratic response in the first couple of days and your antibody levels. It's a great shame, isn't it? Because you think if you felt miserable, then you should be earning a better response. But I'm afraid there have been some scientific studies, and no, there isn't. So some people can have no side effects whatsoever and have very, very good neutralizing antibodies. So we can't really fully explain this, but yeah, it is a common myth, and I bust it quite frequently.
That's a really good, you know what, I didn't even know that, because when I got my jab, I was in bed in the evening and I could not stop shivering, and all I was doing was bragging because I told everyone what a great antibody level I must have, and that's now been shot down. So thank you for myth busting, Maggie. No, your response to the vaccination does not necessarily tell us your antibody response. Dang it. Donna says, I am part of the SOAP study for MDS patients. Will I be able to get my personal results? So that study is one that Blood Cancer UK are funding. Donna, I don't think they give your personal results back to you, but we are expecting a publication from them in the coming weeks. And there is nothing stopping you signing up for the Cancer COVID antibody survey run by Track and Trace, like I told you earlier, or Virus Watch. So if you do really want your results back, sign up for one of those and you'll be able to get your results that way. Debbie says, as a CLL patient with a low level of antibodies after my third dose, would that mean I won't get Ronapreve if I caught COVID? Alison.
I think you've hit upon a really good question, because the guidelines say no antibodies, but as far as I know, we've only had a few patients coming in, to be honest, where we've used this and had a look, and sometimes people have got antibody levels in the low hundreds, and then other times people have got antibody levels in the thousands. So do you call a low 100 or 10 or 15? It's difficult. The guidelines just say no antibodies. So I'm afraid I can't answer that question exactly, because it's how do you define low? And I simply don't know enough about the antibody test myself. I don't know if any of the other panel members have any input on that, but I think it's a really good question.
Definitely. Emma, would you like to come in?
Yeah, so I would say that my understanding is that most centres which look after a lot of immunocompromised patients, so sort of big teaching hospitals that also at the moment have access to Ronapreve, have put in place a committee or a group of clinicians, which includes immunologists, infectious disease doctors, and often hematologists or rheumatologists, people who look after patients who are very immunosuppressed. And they basically assess the patient, look at all their results, and make a decision about whether they will potentially benefit from Ronapreve or not. And my understanding is, because there has been, as you can imagine, we all email each other a lot to discuss these things, there is a little bit of variation between centres. So some centres are following the no antibody, zero result very strictly, and others are taking the antibody level in the context of the rest of the clinical picture of the patient. So for example, if you have an antibody level of 40 or 50, when we know that in a healthy person it's in multiple thousands, and we know the patient is on biologics or has just had treatment for lymphoma, then we would consider that very, very low level of antibodies not to be protective, and potentially those patients could get it. But I think, you know, again, there's a little bit of variability, which is also frustrating. And I mean, I think the reality of that is that sort of variation in clinical practice happens all the time in hospitals all over the world. In the UK, we all do things slightly differently. And what is different now is there's so much more awareness about what's being done in hospitals and what blood results patients have got and what tests they're doing, in a way that these discussions were never had before a couple of years ago. And that's a good thing, but it also, you know, is sometimes a bit challenging to manage. But I think it's worth, at least if you are in the situation, or someone you care about, a family member, a partner, a friend who you know is clinically very vulnerable, very immunosuppressed, I think just be quite ballsy and ask the doctors, you know, what's the justification for their decision. And, you know, you don't lose anything by sort of trying to test the system a bit.
Absolutely. And that's something I'd completely agree with. Definitely advocate for yourselves. Really, really important. Your doctors are trusted, they're incredible, they know what they're doing. But, you know, if you ever have any questions, please do advocate for yourself. I want to come to Rayaz next on Facebook, who has said, I had my 3rd dose 3 weeks ago and my 11-year-old has tested positive yesterday. I am presuming, having had 3rd dose, it should provide some protection. I had my first vaccine 15 days post stem cell transplant and 2nd dose 12 weeks post 1st dose. Just a little anxious as we have COVID in the house now, which sounds like a really, really difficult situation, Rayaz. And I'm sorry that you're having to go through this, because it is really difficult. Does anyone have any practical advice for Rayaz? Maybe Emma, if it was one of your patients, what would you say?
Yeah, so I mean, I am a bone marrow transplant consultant, so I'm guessing you're probably about 6 months or so from your transplant, maybe, or a bit more. And obviously, I don't know whether you're still on immune suppressing drugs like cyclosporin or MMF and things like that, or I think you just have to, I think it's likely you will have a degree of protection. So don't panic, but be really sensible. And I would advocate being quite, I don't know how old your child is as well, which is also 11, sorry, I wasn't listening, I apologize. So so you can probably separate yourself reasonably from your 11-year-old child. You're not having to change nappies and things like that. And I would advocate using different bath towels, for example, using different crockery, not sharing food from the same, and trying to get them to stay in their room. Or you to stay isolated from them a bit when you're at home, because you've been through a lot, and it would, you know, for a matter of a week to 10 days of awkwardness at home, I think it's a really, really sensible thing to try and kind of be as isolated from them as possible. And I appreciate, you know, some people live in very small homes, but if you can keep as separate as possible, no hugs, no kisses. Don't share food and crockery and towels. That's a really good idea.
And just to come in on that, we don't underestimate how difficult that is, isolating from your own child in your own house. That's horrible. It's something we never want to have to do. And what I will say, if you need support, please call our support line. And the number is 0808 2080 888. And we're on the end of the phone. So if you're struggling, please just give us a call, and one of our lovely support advisors will have a chat with you.
And anecdotally, this is purely to make you all laugh, is in the summer when 3 of my household of 5 had COVID, and none of us are vulnerable. My husband and 2 of my teenage kids were COVID positive. As one of our infection control measures, we had 2 big jars of Nutella, and one had COVID written on the lid and the other had non-COVID.
I like how that's the one thing you had to label your jars of Nutella. That tells me a lot about your family.
On every level, that is appalling advice. But anyway, that's only intended to make you smile. It is difficult, yeah.
I want to come and have breakfast in your household. That's all I can say. A message from Jerry on Facebook. Emma mentioned studies about cohorts, i.e. CLL patients and immunity. Any hints as to what they show and when will results be shared? Now, before Emma comments on this, I just want to do a big shout out for our health information pages on our Blood Cancer UK website. There are loads and loads of summaries of the research that has been conducted so far and what they show, and it's all broken down by disease type. So please go and have a read over it. I've spent many hours reading many papers, so I'm just kind of promoting myself a little bit, but we're allowed to do that from time to time. But there is a lot of really interesting information on there, so please do go and look there. But Emma, I know you're carrying out a study yourself, so maybe you want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, so I agree with Rachel. In fact, the Blood Cancer UK website has got really up-to-date data, and what is happening now that whenever we get to a point where we have a complete or partially complete set of results at a particular stage of a study, we tend to submit those for publication, and as soon as we've submitted them, we share a copy of that data and those results with Blood Cancer UK. But we also, Maggie will know that many of the studies that are ongoing, they share their data as soon as it's available with JCVI and also with NHS England and various vaccine task force, so they can act on the data as soon as it's available. So actually, I think there's a very little time lag between data being available and analysed by scientists and doctors and it being available publicly on websites. So I would go to that. And I would just say that some of the studies now are also not just looking at responses to vaccines and B-cell responses and T-cell responses, but there's data emerging now on the risk of breakthrough infections in patients who've been vaccinated, and also comparing immune responses to the different variants of COVID-19 virus. So I think that, keep an eye on the Blood Cancer website. I think that's the best place to look, and they're pretty prompt.
Pretty prompt.
Pretty prompt.
Thank you, Emma. And just on the subject of research and studies, Blood Cancer UK have funded an awful lot of research studies. But none of that would have been possible without people like you supporting our charity and doing incredible things for us. You are the ones who are making this happen and allowing us to fund this research. So, a massive thank you for supporting us and enabling us to do this, because we couldn't without you. And, Maggie wouldn't be able to make decisions on recommendations from the JCVI without all that evidence. So I just cannot explain the enormous value of you donating and supporting us as a charity. It really is huge and massively appreciated. Diane, you've commented on how you can get your antibody results from the COVID cancer survey because you've sent your results back. I'm unsure of that, and obviously we don't have someone on the call tonight, but I know that you will get a response, and I can follow that up with the clinical lead tomorrow and try and get back to you on that. The last thing I wanted to cover quickly was actually to kind of come back to Ronapreve and what people can access and how they can access it if they've got no antibodies or antibodies. And I just wanted to remind people that there are other things coming. So in Sajid Javid's press conference last week, he announced that the UK had bought a number of doses of 2 antivirals. Now that's not licensed by the MHRA yet, so we need to wait for that. But if you do end up in hospital and if you are unwell, that is another type of drug that you might be able to be given, even if you do have antibodies. So you don't necessarily not to have any antibodies to get that. And that I think in clinical trials showed a risk reduction of death by quite a lot, by about 50%, which is great, and a really important drug. So things are coming, things are improving, and as always, Blood Cancer UK will keep advocating for all of you. It's 6:59. This hour has absolutely zoomed past, so I am gonna wrap it up. A massive thank you to our incredible panel. I feel very, very honoured to be sitting here with all of you incredible women doing such amazing things for people across the country, and especially people with blood cancer. So on behalf of everybody watching, thank you so, so much for coming. Really appreciate it. To the people at home, thank you for listening. Thank you for your really insightful and thoughtful questions. They've been brilliant. I've learned a lot. I've learned about the myth of if you have a really horrible response following vaccination, it doesn't mean you have good antibodies. That's something I've learned tonight. I hope people have taken something away too. We have an e-newsletter which we send out regularly that often has numerous updates on antibody studies, research studies, publishing. I think there's a link in the Facebook comments. So if you would like to sign up for that, that would be great. And you'll get all the latest updates straight into your inbox. But yes, that's it. Thank you so much for everyone joining. Really, really appreciate it. And it's been lovely to chat to you all this evening. Thank you.
Thanks, Rachel. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Good evening.
Thank you.
Thank you to Blood Cancer